Welcome to this week's episode of the Making It in Asheville podcast. This is your friendly neighborhood podcast where we sit down with an Asheville local, ask them what they are making and how they are making it in Asheville. And the idea here is that we want to show the many ways that this community is growing and building and supporting one another. And so today's guest, I'm very excited to have. It's Debbie Word of Chemist Gin, Chemist Spirits. And Debbie, please, if you could introduce yourself to the podcast, and then I will tell my story of the first time we saw your space and how I lost my socks in your bar.
I am Debbie Word. I'm the founder and owner of Chemist Spirits here in Asheville in the South Slope area.
Perfect.
Well,
and so,
what else do you want to know?
Yeah, we'll spend the next hour or so going over that. What else I want to know? And so, Chemist Gin, if you're not familiar, I think it's perhaps one of the most beautiful brands, period, but also brands in Asheville. I remember Sarah and I, when we were just like visiting Asheville, thinking about moving, we saw your space on the South Slope, and it was, it would be the coolest, most beautiful place in any city, in any neighborhood that it happened to be. And it happens to be here in Asheville. And it I said I lost my socks because you knocked my socks off. It was just so beautiful. And Sarah and I, one of our favorite cocktails is this Italian hyper bitter Negroni, which, the primary spirit is gin. And so we had to come in and test it out and take it for a test drive. And so since early days, it's been something that I've always wanted to do, is sit down and get to meet the people at Chemist. And so how exciting we get to talk today.
I am excited to speak to you as well. I've listened to your podcasts for a while now, and can't believe I'm actually on it.
That's very generous. I'm blushing if, for those of you watching on YouTube, so thank you for being here. And I want to say, as perhaps the first thing we say, my understanding of your timeline is one of the fastest executions I can conceive of. It's my understanding that perhaps it was December of 2015, or it was like a holiday present. Maybe it wasn't holidays, but you got a home still, like a 5-gallon still. And now here we are about 6 years later, having a very massive, in brand, at least, and I don't know the scale of the operation, but it seems big, gin business and spirit business. And that is like hyper speed for me. And so help us get a sense of where in your business, what is happening today in 2021, and then we'll go back to 2015 and where it all started.
Well, today, it's crazy busy. I actually have to pinch myself occasionally when I really stand back and look at what we've accomplished. But we are branching out more quickly. The pandemic, of course, messed everybody up, but last year was supposed to be our big growth year. And we were very, very fortunate to be able to even just keep it even keel and stay open, because there were so many craft distilleries that just couldn't do it. They just didn't have the cash flow to keep their doors open. So a lot of them across the country ended up closing. So we felt very fortunate to be able to hang on. But in the past several months, we've seen a lot of growth. It's really started opening back up. And we also have a pretty big deal happening this summer. We're launching in Europe. I can tell you about that later, but it's another huge step, and we're growing and hiring more people and expanding, and had to buy another piece of property because we're just so crowded in our space, which we thought would last for quite a while, and we were very mistaken.
Wow.
So we're doing fantastic. It's kind of amazing.
Wonderful. Help me get a sense of the scale of your operation. Like, how many people are we talking about? What is, I don't know how you think about quantities. Is it barrels? Is it bottles? Is it, what's happening right now? So you're growing, you're buying a new place. Is it for production?
No, presently it is just storage,
Oh, wow.
because when you get into manufacturing like this, you have to have all of the components of your product on hand. And at the moment, we can't count on the glass manufacturers to get glass to us in a timely manner. So we're having to buy whole containers of glass, and they need to go somewhere. The glass manufacturers won't hold on to them for us and just ship what we need. They want them out of their warehouse. So what we found was that when we were ordering smaller quantities, it's a lot harder to get the glass manufacturers to schedule us, because then you're just, you're not important enough. So we have learned that we need to scale up, to be able to scale up and have the continuity of having your materials there on hand. You have to have a place to put them. So we have struggled over the last year and a half with borrowing space from Green Man and storing things outside that really shouldn't have been stored outside, but we had no choice. And, then we had problems with the bottles getting dirty and cardboard dissolving, and the boys, the guys who are in the distillery that I work with, were playing Tetris every day, literally with the forklift, moving things around just to be able to get to the production equipment, and moving a pallet of bottles in so we could bottle, but in the meantime had to move IBCs out to be able to just move things around. It's still a daily occurrence. We're almost done with the new property, but
will that be in Asheville, greater Asheville area as well, I suspect?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah, actually in the alcohol business, to stay within, you have to get what's called a bond to store finished product that the taxes have not been paid on yet. And that bond can be extended within 10 miles. So for us to have a second location, it had to be within 10 miles of our production facility. So I had to find property that was far enough out that it wasn't downtown Asheville expensive, but close enough that we could take the truck back and forth to shift, product, or not product, but things like bottles and cardboard and everything back and forth. So we found a place that's about a 12-minute drive, which is not too bad.
Yeah, you can get almost anywhere in 12 minutes in Asheville. So okay, that's it's. And do you have a background in like production of things, like a physical hard good?
No, I had no business getting into this business at all.
It seems like you pointed towards just what would be like a career problem solver, right? Like career.
Yes.
Like I can't imagine like the idea of bonding and like, oh, well, then I just learned that we can go anywhere inside of 10 miles. I don't think common knowledge necessarily. No, and it might be in the industry perhaps, but like I imagine that there's been from 2015 to 2021, just a fire hose of information. And then, then you direct the fire hose towards the fires that are happening inside of a business. What in present day, what are some of like the more interesting perhaps problems, right? So you've talked about running out of bottles. Perhaps you can produce more than you can store, right? Or getting what is the raw input that becomes gin. how are you today faced with problems? And one of them you've already discussed is being able to store the inputs.
Every day is a new day and a new problem.
Yeah.
So, for instance, today I'm still dealing with again bottles, trying to get bottles from California because our bottle supplier doesn't have anywhere in the country other than California, and we need a stopgap because we're actually getting a custom bottle made in China, but it won't be done for a few months. So we're trying to get the last of the bottles that we need of the existing bottle. And then I have to try to get a customs broker and a freight forwarder for the Chinese bottles that will come into Port Wilmington. And I have to, so I'm trying to solve that problem to get that quote to make sure that we can afford to ship the bottles from China, along with trying to get the bottles from California. And of course, freight is ridiculous right now on anything like that. And then there's the barrel problem and the fact that we need some more 53-gallon barrels. And we're searching all over the country right now to get those to get our whiskey put in. It's typically our biggest problems are getting all of the components together at the right time in the right quantity. We were running out of our teacaps that go on the closures for the bottles, and then we ran out of the shrink wraps, and then it's just this constant trying to keep up with supply and inventory and then you have the fire marshal visits and the and the list of things we have to do for him, and working with the ABC system in North Carolina is quite the challenge. It's one
like
of the
could be.
North Carolina tends to be one of the most difficult states to start a distillery. It's just things are changing. They're actually gradually getting better. There's a lot of improvement that still needs to be done, but North Carolina tends to be way behind the rest of the country in changing laws and getting things to the point where they're supporting their manufacturers, and particularly in the spirits industry, because there's this conception in North Carolina. We are in part of the Bible Belt, and spirits were given this evil. What's the word for it? It was played off 100 years ago as being what was killing the community, what was ruining men and ruining families, and you had the suffragettes and all of this pulling together. So Prohibition happened, and that was supposed to be saving the families and decreasing alcoholism and all of that. It was made out to be this evil thing.
Yeah.
And it was always taxed higher than anything else. And that was also perceived to be because it was evil, and it was a habit that people shouldn't have, therefore they should pay high taxes, kind of like cigarettes. Very similar. Well, as it turns out, it's amazing how much you learn when you dive into something like this. I did not realize, and I think most people don't realize, that the reason that the taxes are so high on spirits, much higher than on beer or wine or anything else, goes back to the Revolutionary War. And it actually was a tax that was proposed by George Washington to pay for the Revolutionary War. And it started then, and it wasn't supposed to last forever. But of course, once the government was making that money, huge money, they never backed off of it. And it gave this impression of spirits should be taxed, enormously, because it's something you shouldn't be doing anyway. It's a vice. And so that actually is where the high taxes have come from. And that's something that the manufacturers are trying to get reduced, because we should have parity with the other alcohol producers. And
what are we talking about in a tax rate? Are we talking
one bottle? And this is just very round numbers.
Yeah.
When we sell a bottle, half of that goes to taxes.
Wow. So do not pass go. Do not collect any money until you've given half of it. How interesting.
Yes. Wow. And people don't realize that. They can't figure out why spirits are so expensive, but that's because we pay such a high rate that there has to be a profit margin in there somewhere. But the state makes, and the federal government, both, mostly the state actually, make way more money off of our bottles than we do.
Yeah.
So it's eye-opening.
And holy moly! And then I imagine, as with most, well, this is my perspective, but I feel like rules like high tax or prohibition often just result in, incentives have funny outcomes, right? But result in speakeasies and moonshining and keeping stuff off the books. And so nothing necessarily changes except for everything changes. And so my dad, when we first were saying that we're going to move down to Asheville, he's one of those guys who watches like Moonshiners, the television show, and watches all these whatever channel that is, everything that's on that channel. And so he's like, oh, there's a bunch of people we watch who have stills in the woods back out there. That's cool. And so North Carolina has incredible tax history. What are you familiar at all with North Carolina's, I imagine illicit alcohol history?
Absolutely. That actually was what spurred me on to try to make spirits up in the mountains. We have a place west of here in the middle of nowhere, off 4 miles back a dirt road.
Yeah.
And this is actually how this all started. You're giving me an opening to talk about how we started all this. The area where our cabin was known for stills all through those mountains. And we actually, before moonshine was allowed by the TTB as a type of alcohol, which happened, it's several years ago now, but back in the 90s, you didn't see something on the shelf that said moonshine. It was not an allowed TTB. When I say TTB, that's our federal governing agency. Okay. And they changed that law, and then you saw these moonshine manufacturers pop up. Well, before that, we actually had to get moonshine from a moonshiner, which really I was never allowed to know the name of who I was getting it from. It was always through a third person who would then meet me somewhere in a parking lot or, So that's how we used to get moonshine. And it was literally for entertainment purposes when we had company coming, because from other parts of the country, they all wanted to try moonshine, the real thing. And
sure, you go to Philly,
we had some from. Exactly. So we would build a campfire and sit around the campfire and pass the jug, and it would. So I had different samples from different areas, and some from Tennessee, some from Western Carolina, some from Georgia, a couple different, some peach moonshine, which is actually peach brandy, and I could not actually stomach it. I would take a tiny sip and then just shudder, and it was always awful, and I couldn't figure out why. And I figured there had to be a way to make it better. And so, how are they, if moonshine is off of these backwood stills is so terrible, how are they making rum that tastes good, gin that tastes good, or whiskey that tastes good? So I just dove in and started just started researching a little bit, and
Sure.
then decided I needed my own still, and just to play with. It was just going to be a hobby. And my husband finally acquiesced and gave me one for Christmas. And the funny thing about that is it actually was made in the Asheville area, handmade copper pot still, by a guy who was had a small business. And we had to meet him in the parking lot to get it from him, because he wouldn't let anybody. He must have been doing some things that were a little bit on the edge of illegal, because he didn't want anyone to know where he was actually manufacturing these.
How interesting.
So yeah. So anyway, that's how I ended up with the still, and then just started playing with it, I really wasn't trying to make moonshine. Moonshine is typically a corn base. And I veered off of that immediately. I decided I wanted to make rum. So I started with molasses and sugar and trying different recipes. And we were actually getting some good stuff.
And I'll pause you here just in case people following along aren't necessarily familiar with spirits or moonshine. I don't pretend to be familiar with spirits or moonshine in any capacity, but when you say terrible, the thing that showed up in my mind is like it tastes like you're drinking like gasoline. It is very alcohol and like an alcohol rub versus something that you would want to drink. This is perhaps like painful fire heat in your mouth that is not necessarily pleasant or something you would sign up for if you had other options, if you had alternatives.
Correct.
And then with spirits and with anything alcohol based, my understanding is that there's a lot of ways to do a lot of things, but generally speaking, you're in categories based on the carbohydrate that you use to create the alcohol. So beer is often hops, and then you said, molasses and sugar is often rum. Potatoes can be vodka. But the carbohydrate is pretty much the thing upon which the spirit is defined, more or less.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, there are those like vodka can be wheat, corn, just about anything, actually. Vodka is by definition, a tasteless and odorless alcohol. So it's actually just distilled over and over and over until it's tasteless, basically.
Sure.
Which is why it's so used so much in mixed drinks.
Yeah. And maybe a better example then would be, wine comes from grapes and sake rice, right? So like that. Where I went potatoes shows my limited knowledge of the space. But so you immediately say corn, other people can get good with corn. I want to do things that trajectory point towards more mouth fun than pain.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. And corn, I said a lot of
it has a place. With whiskeys, corn can be.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people who use sugar for moonshine. What I did discover in my education, I believe the reason that I never liked moonshine is because what we do when we distill is the alcohol is boiled, comes to a certain temperature, and each alcohol is or the fermented liquid actually is boiled. And what happens is the different alcohols that have been created and are in that are boiled off at different temperatures. So the very first alcohol that comes off the still is going to be poisonous, basically. You literally, they're called 4 shots, you throw them away. They're also very good for cleaning things, but you do not drink them. The next thing that comes off the still is a different alcohol.
And when you say comes off the still, this is where I start to imagine there's like some sort of tube that winds its way away from a
Worm.
boiling, right? Like boiling area. And then it goes away and it drips off into a side. And when you say comes off a still, that's what I should think. The
Yes,
first things
yes,
that
yes.
leave
Sorry,
and
I
drip
was
off.
jumping ahead. Yeah, and in our situation, we have pot stills, what is called a line arm, which is what the vapor goes up into. It's the tube that goes over to the condenser, and the condenser then is a chilled, um, almost like a chilled bucket that
Yeah.
the vapor then is passed through, which, if you remember science, that turns it back into a liquid.
Cool.
So, and then
Wild.
it drips off the still. So yes, so the first thing that actually goes through that transformation, you throw away. The next part is what's called the heads. And the heads have particular alcohols that can give you, that they smell different. They have a different mouthfeel. They taste. They can have congeners in them, which are off taste, off flavor, that you don't want in your alcohol. But as it goes through the heads, it then comes into what we call the hearts. And so the distiller's job is to make the cuts. He has to keep tasting it until it gets to the point in the heads that it's acceptable. You want a little bit of the heads in the final product. But then he cuts and gets rid of those heads over there that aren't going to go in it. And then he lets the still continue. It goes into the hearts. The hearts are the best part. They are the alcohol that is the most pure. It is the alcohol that will not make you sick unless you, of course, drink way too much. But that is the best tasting, best mouthfeel. It's what you're really looking for. And then it goes into the tails. So you've got the heads, the hearts, and the tails. And the tails, again, will be a different kind of alcohol, which, again, can have off flavors and then can make you sick. And then it goes, and then you finish. And what you're looking for is that center part, a little bit of the tails, a little bit of the heads. Well, what I've been told, what moonshiners will do a lot of times is they will take all the heads, put those in a jug, take all the tails, mix that with the heads, and they keep the hearts for themselves.
That makes sense.
Okay. And so you end up with the heads and the tails in this moonshine that they sell you. And that's the stuff that really makes you sick.
Yeah.
And that's why it doesn't taste good, because it's got all those congeners in there. But it'll get you drunk. And that is what a lot of people are looking for. So,
well, thank you for taking us for taking us through that. And that makes, a lot of sense. Imagine, wow. Yeah. And yeah. So, but then that's moonshine. That can be any number of carbohydrates that turn into an alcohol. And if I'm not mistaken, moonshine, is there a category moonshine, right? So you mentioned the TBB, BBT.
TTB.
TTB now has a category called moonshine. What is moonshine? And you're not, Chemist isn't making moonshine that I'm aware of. You're making gin. And so how did we get from this curiosity into gin?
Well, because what I started leaning toward when I started making alcohol was to make something that I like to drink, and rum was one of those. That's where I started, but then discovered gin, and that actually became the focus. And we actually started really enjoying what was coming off the still. And that's it. It just happened. I can't even tell you how it happened. We were sitting, I was sitting with my daughter, Danielle, who is the chemist, my son-in-law, James, who is now my creative director. He's very talented graphic designer. And we were up in the mountains sitting around the kitchen table while the gin was coming off the still, and started talking about the prohibition and that era. And my daughter, being a chemist, we were laughing about the fact that it was chemists and pharmacists were the only legal producers of alcohol during the Prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
And they did it. They would write prescriptions. Take this whiskey for your cough or for consumption or whatever it was, whatever ailed anybody. And that was a very prevalent medication back then. So Danielle being a chemist, we started it literally happened around the kitchen table that day. And we started talking about, wow, Asheville has so many breweries, but they really don't have, at that time, they didn't have any other distilleries, any craft distilleries. And it just, someone around the table said, man, wouldn't it be fun to start a distillery in Asheville?
Man.
You should not have said that to me.
Yeah. Fun is a word.
Yeah. Fun was what we thought. Yeah.
That's amazing. And I had a moment, it was a handful of years back at this point, where when I grew up and, was first introduced to drinking alcohol, gin was like the thing that I decided I didn't like, no way. Ugh. And who drinks gin anyway? Right. Like was one of my logics. Like, I don't want to be a gin drinker. And then all of a sudden I'm in my late 20s and I'm thinking about the cocktails that I order and like what I like the most. And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm a gin drinker. Like after all this time, like now I am a gin drinker. My sense of self flipped on its head one day when we were in New York. And your name, Chemist, reminds me, there's this kind of secret but not secret bar in Chinatown in New York on this little side street that hooks, and there's no way you get to it unless you are like trying to. And its sign has like a potion and it says, chemists. And I remember being in that area.
I know the bar you're talking about.
Yeah. And so there's this, I remember seeing it for the first time and being like, this is absolute lunacy. I'm like middle of the day in Chinatown. I was meeting someone and I was just killing time. Like, this is crazy. And then a couple of years later, I go there and it's like the coolest and most, special cocktail experience that I've probably ever had. Yeah. I took Sarah when she moved to New York, and I hear you on, there's this really beautiful story to be told about specifically the chemists and alcohol prohibition, and even today. And I can imagine the feeling, the excitement at that dinner table, thinking, hey, we might have an idea here. And there's, I'll just assume that everyone on the podcast at some point has had a moment where they're like, that I think we have a thing. I think we have a thing that could be a thing very different. The energy at that coffee table, dinner table, often wanes by the next morning, and definitely will disappear for most people in a couple weeks, at the very longest, a year. To go from home still to second location to buy raw supplies and store them in 5 years is a lot. What were some of your first steps when you got the bug and convinced yourself that somehow it was going to be fun and not a nightmare of legal and operational burden?
Well, I tend to jump in with both feet. And so I went to Asheville and started looking for property. And within
property. Okay.
Yeah. And I looked at a few places and was just kind of getting an idea of what the city would allow us to do, because at that point there were no distilleries in downtown Asheville. We were the first to actually be in the city limits. And so I needed to confirm with them that they would allow us to build a distillery in the central business district. Once I got that confirmation, I knew I could look downtown. We knew just from the first pulling the concept together, that we wanted to take advantage of the fact that Asheville is.
What is happening? Debbie, can you hear me? Hello. We're back.
I'm going to be at the bar having a drink when you come.
Listen, I can't describe how I'm feeling right now. I know that some settings have changed in the last 5 minutes. I don't know. Test speaker, H5. Holy moly. This is.
It can't be on my side, can
No,
it?
it's me. I don't know what's happening. I don't know. This is the exact setup we use every week. Sarah's not even in the office normally. My wife's on the other side stealing internet. I am plugged directly in. Huh. It is me. I apologize.
Oh, please. Not like there's anything you can do about it.
No, goodness. So you're going to get a gold star and a sticker to commemorate your patience in this conversation. So you looked for real estate and you, I'm going to do a little snap just in case, help find this in the future. But you looked for real estate. You got the okay that you could potentially have a still in downtown. So you start looking in downtown, central business.
Mm-hmm. And we were looking for something that was walkable because, just especially during tourist season, everyone's out. And that just helps dramatically with your marketing and just being seen versus having to draw people to you. And we happened upon the space where we ended up. It was Elf Auto. Cox Avenue used to be, it went through several transformations, but back in the 1920s, it was all auto sales. You've got the Sawyer building that is now has been converted, and several others that were auto dealerships.
Sure.
And then over the years, it declined some and it turned over to auto repair places. So all down Cox Avenue used to be auto repair place. This was one of the last ones. And it was a 1990s Morton building with bays down the side and a parking lot between it and Funkatorium.
Wow.
And it had just come on the market when we saw it, and I jumped on it and made an offer, and they almost didn't accept it, but then they did. By the way, I could not touch that property now. The values have just
for anyone
soared.
Who's not necessarily familiar, it like you have premier South Slope, location storefront on Cox, and in our 2 years in Asheville and a little bit more when you think about when our first visit was, I've seen crazy growth in that area specifically of Asheville. So I mean, y'all represent, I imagine, a meaningful moment in the Slopes history, but I honestly, I can't imagine. So it was just timing wise, serendipitous.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. They tried after we had signed the offer and everything, and we're in due diligence. They tried to back out because they got an offer that we were told was significantly higher than ours.
Believe it.
But we held them to it, thank goodness. And originally, all I was going to do was build a distillery, and the parking lot was going to stay parking. And it was actually in the middle of the design phase that I had this epiphany that, wait a minute, that property's a gold mine. And if we can build a bar next door that could be the mouthpiece for the distillery, and you have all this pedestrian traffic back and forth, and there was no cocktail lounge in South Slope. It was all breweries. So it's like we should probably just dive into this. And that's why Antidote happened.
Wow. And when did that open, Antidote? And
it opened 6 months after the distillery opened in June of 2018. And Antidote opened about 6 months later, the end of 2018.
Wonderful. And we moved here midway through 2019, so 6 months. And it has to have made your presence in the South Slope, I think, probably helped or has some very meaningful impact on South Slope that is outside of my scope of understanding. But to go from, we think that we're going to just be a still distillery, to we're going to have a location, to we have one of the most beautiful executions that I've seen in the space. How does that happen? I've asked sort of lightly, what is your background? Because it seems that with most everything that I'm seeing from the outside in, it's really high level execution, implementation. Had you ever designed a space? Do you just know how to find the right partners and architects? And how did you go from
I have
nothing
some
to something?
Background. Okay. I in my former life was a landscape architect, and I realized many years ago I should have just been an architect. I should have. I loved. I was young enough and in college, and thought if I was I love architecture, but if I'm a landscape architect, I'll get to be outside a lot. Instead, I was behind a drafting board the majority of the time. But the part of landscape architecture, if people don't know what that is, it's not being a landscaper. It's a college design degree, and it actually incorporates a lot of hardscapes, road alignments. You have to know a lot of engineering. We had to take a lot of architecture classes and design a lot of buildings. It integrates the landscape or the land with architecture. So it's a combination of the two. So I did have that background, and I did do when I worked for a landscape architect many years ago, actually right out of college, one of the main jobs that I had was doing historic preservation of restoration of facades in some of the downtown areas in Kentucky, which is where I was living then. Some of these older towns. And I just really got into historic preservation and preserving the aesthetic. So when I went into this, and we knew we were going to revolve around the Prohibition era, I immediately, it was just obvious, this building needs to look like it was built at the turn of the century and was an apothecary in downtown Asheville. So I studied some of downtown Asheville's architecture, and I settled on what is called cast iron architecture. So if you look at the front of Antidote, there are big cast iron columns with the big rivets. It gives it a lot of its character. And that was very prevalent back at the turn of the century. There is some cast iron architecture downtown Asheville, but it was all over the country. That just became a really popular design element. So we had the Morton building, which I was trying to save, thinking, well, if nothing else, we have a roof. If we have to gut it, we still get the roof out of it. It has to be something, this is a usable space. Well, of course, in the end, I should have just torn it down and started over.
Classic.
Because all of the upfitting we had to do, it would have been much smarter. But we had that space that we were dealing with, and we had to integrate that look with the brand new building, which is Antidote. And make them look like they kind of came together. So
incredible.
But I'm very, I've been called a lot of things. I'm very particular. I'm very detail oriented, and that all fed into the historic look of the building. I obsessed for 2.5 years over every little detail and every piece of furniture that went in Antidote, everything that went into the tasting room. almost every single piece is an actual antique. Some things we couldn't do as antiques because they wouldn't have held up. I've lost a few antiques in Antidote that have
grown
not
legs and walked out.
Well, we have had quite a few small things that have been picked up, but no, things that were antiques that didn't stand the test of time with customers that we've had to take out the back door because they fell apart.
Got it.
But yeah, I just get obsessed with making it look as authentic as possible.
It's amazing. I can't imagine even if the opposite approach were to happen, where it's like, well, I like home distilling. Let me start with a small space somewhere not close to a town. Let me try and get good and build a small thing and like grow over time. Your 2 feet approach seems heroic and also like terrifying. And so how did you go about either fundraising or getting bank support? Like, what did the process look like? Had you been saving for a visionary business at some point? It's one thing to have an idea, to execute on it. At some point, money needs to show up. What was your plan early days?
Early days was to prove to my husband that I could do this, because there was a lot of negative energy around believing, because I'd never run a business. Mm-hmm. I obviously had never been a distiller. I've built a lot of buildings. I knew I could do the architecture and construction side of it. But yeah, it was jumping into something I really didn't know what I was jumping into. So I decided I was going to go to the bank and get loans. And I kept running into walls, and it was a lot of this had to do with being a female. There in the early days, that was a big struggle, which it didn't even dawn on me that anyone would care that I wasn't a man. But I have learned that distilling is very much a man's world, and women are finally coming on and starting to become a much bigger part of this business and this whole endeavor. But just 5 years ago, there were very, very few. And I would have men look at me and just scratch their heads and go, "Oh, honey, I don't think so." It was very frustrating. So I also did, I shouldn't give the name. It was a business help kind of volunteer entity that I went to speak about starting a business, because I knew I was going to need help and I didn't know anything. And there were a couple of gentlemen that sat down with me, retired businessmen, and I got the same negativity from them. They said, "We don't think this is a good idea. This will never fly." And all of those things, though, just spurred me on. It just made, you don't tell me I can't do something. I'm that person where I'm going to make it happen because you told me I couldn't do it or it wasn't going to work. So
yeah, and it's such an interesting thing where there's almost a fine line where if you're getting a million yeses, like something's wrong, right? Like why? Like what about it, and how many other people then are doing it? And like there almost needs to be some sort of very real barrier, hurdle thing early days to sort of like, it's an indication that maybe there's something here. And then there are also obviously moments where when people are saying, "Hey, this is like not a good idea," there are times where you have to listen. But it's like, wait, you mean to tell me in a town that gets a ton of tourism and is known for alcohol already, that a luxe, beautiful, high touch brand with a beautiful execution with like ideal real estate in downtown couldn't be successful? Get out of here. Like, of course it could be. And so like, if you know that, I imagine it makes some of the hardships of a lot of no's and perhaps pandering or whatever, however you'd communicate the oh honeys, which I can't honestly imagine. Or so I hopefully it gave you the steel to continue. But what happened? Like, did you fundraise with women founders? Did you
I
change a pitch?
hats off to Mountain BizWorks.
Okay.
I did a couple of their business classes, and that helped tremendously understand just the basics and what I needed to do. I thought about crowdfunding at one point, but then decided that I had enough faith in this. And I was fortunate enough to have the means to do it without getting anybody else's financial help, and just decided I was just going to do it. I'm not 25 years old anymore, and my kids are grown, and we had money put away, and it was something that I felt strongly about. And I said, if nothing else, if the investment becomes the property,
there's something.
The way I saw it going, it was like, so if the distillery dies, it doesn't make it, I still have the property. It's a wonderful investment, and I don't feel like I'm going to lose one way or another. So why not just go ahead and do it? So that's basically what happened. We just ended up deciding to fund it ourselves.
And have people since seeing, because one thing, I had this idea, maybe you have somebody that's a graphic designer put together a deck, and, you take a business workshop class. So now you can tell a story of like, here's how it's functionally going to return your capital in 6 years. And everyone says no. And then all of a sudden you have a space. All of a sudden lights are going in. All of a sudden they can taste and look at a bottle. Have you taken investments since in the last 5 years? Like, are people trying to give you money? Has anything changed there?
Well, I have. There have been people who have. I never really knew if they were serious, but yeah, people have been interested in becoming part of it. But once I dove in the way I did, and the whole idea in the beginning was this is a family business.
Yeah.
I wasn't building this to turn around and sell it. I was building it for my family and for my daughter and son-in-law and their kids. And hopefully the hope and the drive is that this company will still be there when my granddaughter is 21 and she can become part of the business. So to bring in other investors at this point, I have no interest at all.
What a beautiful, I mean, it makes me feel and think a lot of things, but at the end of the day, if you can if you can execute and own a project outright, that's almost like there are benefits of having, a board or an investment or advisors who have experience and can make connections and have some skin in the game. So they actually do the things that they promised that they would do anyway. But it does seem like, all things equal, having ownership and the ability to move quickly or make decisions is helpful. And there's a bunch of restaurateurs in New York who I've watched their trajectories, and it's like they do however many restaurants, and then at some point it's just they do the restaurants themselves because they know and they can move faster and it's easier. And if you have the resources, it seems like that's a beautiful thing. And I imagine that the tables would turn at some point, and they might have where people now want to give you money. Banks want to be your creditor, and they're like, good riddance, cash flow is all right.
Yeah, as long as we can float, and get through the tough times, it doesn't. I don't want a committee making every decision and feeling like someone else's money is on the line. It's It is a different mentality when it is yours, and you
Yeah.
know that the way it's presented is going to reflect on you. And
Yeah.
if I brought other people in, that would muddy the water a little bit, I think. So
That's great. And I'm wondering, so your gin, talk to me like, and you've mentioned, I heard at one moment, I left it alone, but you said whiskey. And so what's happening in the spirits? How are we feeling about, the core product here?
well, the core product, of course, was our American gin, and we quickly started throwing it in barrels. So we had our barrel rested, and then we made Navy strength, which is one of my favorites. Um, but we always had assumed at some point we would actually make whiskey.
Hmm.
A really good single malt is what we're making at the moment, which means that the definition of single malt is actually that it's made in a single facility. It's not necessarily just one grain, which is what a lot of people think. But we are using we're using just malted barley, local as possible. We get our for these last batches, we've been making whiskey for 3 straight months, to be able to start really putting it away and let it sit. We've already released our Founders Reserve. We've had 2 releases. We're going to be releasing our 3rd, and the Founders Reserve concept was really that it was our very first that we made, and that is made from local grain. Those barrels were chosen and blended in-house very carefully, and it's very limited release. So our Founders Reserve single malt whiskey is being released in small batches. But what we did this year is we really ramped it up and have produced a lot more this year that will go in barrels, in various size barrels, so that we can release some of it younger, but we're also going to put some 53-gallon barrels, full-size barrels, away for years and continue to build on that, so that eventually, hopefully, we have all 53-gallon barrels and it's all aged a lot longer.
And if I'm not mistaken, on smaller bottles, it has something to do with the ratio of contact to the wood.
Yeah.
And so a smaller barrel can age a little bit faster and get to the same space.
Much faster. Our first release was 1 year and 2 months. And it actually, one thing too that a lot of people don't realize is the reason that whiskey has historically been aged for longer periods in large barrels is it tends to cover up being in a barrel. It will somewhat erase the not so great aspects of the white dog that they made. White dog being right off the still, clear liquor that then goes into the barrel. Being in a barrel for a longer period of time will smooth that out, will change the mouthfeel. It'll take the edge off. If you start with a really, really good product coming off the still, you use the best malted barley, you make your cuts really close so that you're not putting in a lot of heads and tails. You just use really good brewing practices. What comes off the still is actually pretty good in itself, and then it can go in a smaller barrel and actually come out with a lot of those characteristics that you would equate with something that's been in a barrel for years, because it didn't start with those problems.
Yeah, more aggressive.
Started out well. So it's really what goes in dictates what comes out. So our really young, smaller barrel whiskeys, it's fooled a lot of people. They don't even realize that it's that young because it started out good. But we would like to move into the bigger barrels. Just there are a lot of perks. Your cost cost of goods is lower because the smaller barrels are more expensive per
Yeah, it's
leader. And
a economy of scale type of a
yeah,
situation. That
yeah.
makes sense. And how interesting. So have you pretty much like raised a flag? I mean, your brand looks and feels like it's been there forever, right? It's beautiful. Has that helped bring like talent in who want to do beautiful American spirits? What does the talent pool look like? I imagine we had a guest at one point said like you can't throw a cat without hitting a yoga instructor or a brewer in Asheville, and I don't recommend anyone throw cats, but I'm
Yeah.
wondering what does the pool look like of experience and uh, labor in distilling? Is it
It's
comparable?
the pool is very small
Okay.
because yes, brewers they flock here, obviously,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of amazing talent there. What has brought more distillers to the area is the AB Tech started this distilling program.
Hmm.
I guess it's been about 5 years ago now, because our first distiller was one of the first graduates of that distilling program that was in tandem with the brewing program that they do at AB Tech. They're small classes, and people are coming from outside of the area to attend those distilling classes. I think it's a couple of year degree.
Mm-hmm.
And he came to us. He actually
Cool.
found us before we opened. We actually started working with him like 6 months before we opened. But I knew nothing about business, really knew nothing about manufacturing and everything we were going to have to learn. But I knew enough that I knew I needed help of somebody who knew what they were doing. So I started looking for a consultant way back, it was back in the very beginnings of designing the building. I started looking for a consultant. And on a random trip to Scotland with my sister, and of course I was all about distilleries at that point. It's like,
Sure.
I have to go to every small distillery I can find. Happened upon this small distillery in Scotland, and turned out the owner of that distillery became our consultant.
Oh, cool.
And we went over there and worked on his stills, and then used those same stills. They're out of Portugal. They were handmade for us. They're very traditional alembic pot stills. And we ended up duplicating that system over here, although we use direct fire because, again, I wanted to be very traditional. And that is actually the original way spirits were made, was on alembic pot stills with direct fire. So we have giant burners that sit under those pots.
Wild.
His heating system was steam coiled, and we just it was me, not we. I decided we weren't doing that.
Yeah.
But other than that, it's the same system that he had over there. And he has stayed with us. He still is involved in our production. He oversees what the guys are doing. He's been involved in a lot of different things, but he was making trips over here a few times a year. And obviously that hasn't happened for a little while. But
wow.
yeah.
And so to look to the future, production will still kind of happen where production is. You're now have a lot more raw materials. You're going to have storage for that shortly. What are we thinking on the back half of 2021? Excited just to get more product into the market?
Yes, that's what we're working on. Mostly, we just hired a new head of sales. Brought him in actually from the brewing industry. Yeah, we're pushing getting into different markets and pushing more in the state. We have a sales team that we're very fortunate to have that as well. A lot of craft distillers can't afford to hire people full-time for sales, but we felt like it was really important to get our product out there.
Sure.
to actually have. They're really brand ambassadors in North Carolina because we're in a control state. They can't actually sell our product, but they can visit all of the ABC stores. They can visit all the bars, restaurants, and introduce our product. And they can do events and do training for bartenders and that kind of thing. So they're brand ambassadors, but they pay close attention to the metrics and are watching what they're doing and how that's influencing how things are spreading across the state. And then there's Georgia and Tennessee. We've got distributors in both of those states that handle the sales for us there, but we still visit there to get on premise to actually get our product in people's hands. So
wonderful. Wow.
Yeah.
Not easy. And to think about that timeline, 6 years sounds like a lot. And I know that it's not. It has to have moved in a blink of an eye for you. I'm wondering, how long have you been in Asheville?
I have actually lived here for about 5 years now, but
Okay.
that was, this was a foregone conclusion because I lived in the deep South and always felt like a fish out of water. The mountains is where I belong. We started coming up to the mountains to escape the heat back in the 80s and then ended up buying a place. So my girls were they were about half raised up here. And then they got married, moved, started having children, moved away. And that became the time I was just itching to get up here. So this all just kind of fell into place at the right time. It was like my daughter ended up with her job at the VA. James, who is the marketing director, who has done all of our branding, and that's been amazing.
Pat on the back for James. Yeah. Wow.
Yes. We couldn't have done what we did without that. And in fact, I told him I wouldn't start this business unless he came with me. So, no pressure there from your mother-in-law, but but he could work from anywhere. So because he was graphic designer and that's what he was doing at the time. But then when he came on board with me, it all fell into place right about the right time.
It's a beautiful thing. Well, I'm going to ask a question that we ask all of our guests, and that is when you think about Asheville and you think about community, what shows up for you with those two words?
Oh, it's everything. It is everything. When I think about the brewing community in particular, they embraced us, and it just made us feel like we were a part, even though we're not a brewery. But in the very beginning, now I will say, a lot of the guys were pretty wary of this woman who just came into town and was doing something that no one else had done. But once they got to know me and we got to know all of us, and we started doing some collaborations with some of the breweries, that just gelled, and we have great relationship with so many of them, and they're also talented. But the artistic community, it's part of what drew me to Asheville. It's so much more comfortable here, just feeling like there's this glue that holds Asheville together, that it's an undercurrent of community and watching out for other people and not being so competitive and backbiting. And I think everybody wants to lift everyone else up. I think we all realize that if you help everyone do better, that we all benefit, and it becomes a more beautiful community and city. And so it's made all the difference to us. Absolutely.
That's wonderful to hear. And that is that's the reason this podcast exists, is to try and do those things that you just pointed to. And I am so grateful for your time today. And I look forward to coming by, perhaps a Negroni, perhaps one of your earlier batches of a whiskey. But I'm so thankful. Thank you for joining us today.
You are very welcome. And I would love for you to come by and have a private tour and just hang out with us.